The wind tore across the plains like a living thing, carrying the bitter chill of early winter that sank into Eleanor's bones. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, but it did little to stave off the cold. Her boots sank slightly into the frost-hardened dirt with every step, and the faint creak of the wooden gate ahead made her stomach tighten. Midnight had always felt like a cruel hour to the living, but desperation had a way of making impossible things seem necessary. She had walked these streets, knocked on doors, pleaded at shops, but every answer had been the same: it's too late. Come back in the morning. The ranch on the edge of town had seemed like a long shot, but a note pinned to the general store's bulletin board had promised work for someone willing to keep odd hours. She didn't even know what the work entailed, only that the name scribbled at the bottom, McAllister Ranch, was enough to guide her here. And so, she found herself shivering under the starless sky, standing at a door that seemed impossibly large and heavy for such a lonely place. Her hand shook as she lifted it to knock. Each rap sounded louder than she intended, echoing across the empty land, mixing with the distant howls of coyotes. A part of her wanted to turn away, to run back to the safety of the town, to the warmth of her room in the faint hope that tomorrow might bring something better. But another, fiercer part, a part hardened by months of struggle, by nights spent hungry and afraid, demanded that she stay, that she see this through. The door creaked, and for a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then it swung open. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, his clothes worn and patched from years of labor under the relentless sun. His hair, dark but streaked with gray, fell in uneven strands around a weathered face. His eyes, though, were what struck her most: deep, tired, and haunted, yet flickering with a softness that seemed out of place in such a rugged figure. And in his arms, cradled carefully against his chest, was a small baby, no more than a few months old. The infant's face was red from crying, tiny fists scrunching against the man's chest as he soothed it with murmured words Eleanor could barely hear. For a moment, Eleanor forgot why she was there. She had expected a stern rancher, a man who would scrutinize her credentials or laugh at her audacity for knocking at such an hour. Instead, she found grief and exhaustion etched into every line of his face, mirrored in the child he held. Her own heart twisted. She wanted to look away, not wanting to intrude on a moment so intimate, yet she couldn't help but step forward, drawn by a strange, unexplainable pull. I'm looking for work," she said, her voice barely louder than a whisper. It sounded ridiculous even to her ears, the words faltering as they left her mouth. She felt foolish, an interloper stepping into a life she barely understood. The man's gaze lifted to meet hers fully, and there was a pause, long, careful, as if he were weighing her presence. Then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders relaxed. "You're not scared of a little midnight work?" His voice was rough, gravelly from years of shouting over wind and livestock, but it carried a note of something gentler now. "Good, I could use some help." Eleanor blinked, startled. She had expected rejection, maybe even irritation, but not this quiet acceptance. She noticed the way the baby's small head rested against his chest, how his large hands cradled the tiny body with meticulous care. There was something raw and human in the sight, something that made the ache of her own loneliness seem sharper. "Are you sure?" she asked, still hesitant, stepping closer. The porch beneath her feet was worn, the wood groaning. With every shift in weight, the man's eyes softened further, and a faint, almost imperceptible nod confirmed it. "Yes, come in. It'll be easier inside," he said, shifting the baby slightly as if to make room for her. Eleanor swallowed hard, brushing imaginary lint off her coat, and stepped over the threshold into a warmth that immediately contrasted the chill outside. The smell of hay, firewood, and something faintly sweet, milk, perhaps, wrapped around her, grounding her. For the first time in months, she felt the pull of home. As the door closed behind her, the wind outside seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet rustle of the infant and the steady breathing of a man who had been through more grief than Eleanor could imagine. She realized, with a surprising jolt, that she was not just here for work. Somehow, in this unexpected encounter, her life had shifted in ways she couldn't yet understand. Inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around Eleanor like a gentle embrace, melting the chill that had clung to her all night. The ranch house smelled of hay, wood smoke, and something else, something soft and domestic that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen, long since gone. The flickering light from the hearth cast shadows that danced across the rough-hewn walls, highlighting the simplicity of the home. Everything spoke of years of hard work, worn furniture, patched curtains, and the faint scuff of boots against the floorboards. The man carried the baby toward a makeshift crib in the corner of the main room. The child's cries had begun to quiet slightly, but the small body still trembled against his chest. Eleanor hesitated, unsure whether she should help. She wasn't used to children. Her life had been shaped by responsibility and survival, not by lullabies or tender hands, but something about the scene stirred a protective instinct she hadn't recognized in herself. "My wife, she's gone," he said quietly, as if speaking the words aloud might keep them from sinking in too deeply. "And now it's just me and him. Can't do it all alone." Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. She knelt beside the crib, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the blanket around the baby. The infant turned toward her, eyes still wet with tears but curious, and Eleanor's heart clenched. She offered a small, tentative smile. "What's his name?" she asked softly, afraid that any wrong move might make him cry again. "He's Sam," the man replied, voice roughened with grief but carrying a strange warmth when he said it. "Samuel, named after my father." Eleanor hummed a low tune, instinctively rocking the crib, and to her surprise, the baby's cries softened. The rancher watched her carefully, leaning against the doorway, his hands crossed loosely over his chest. There was a tension there, a protective vigilance, yet a flicker of relief passed over his features. She was helping. She was staying. Hours passed in a blur. Eleanor patched a broken fence by the light of a lantern, her hands growing raw from the cold and the splintered wood. She stirred the fire, replenishing it with fresh logs, and carefully prepared a small meal for both the rancher and herself. Sam fussed intermittently, but Eleanor learned quickly how to calm him, rocking him gently and murmuring nonsensical words that somehow worked. The rancher watched quietly, occasionally speaking to her in low tones about the ranch, the livestock, and the seasons. His words were simple, but they carried a weight of loneliness and exhaustion, a life reduced to survival and care for a small child. Eleanor listened, fascinated by the depth behind his eyes, the way each line in his face told a story she couldn't begin to imagine. "You handle him well," he said finally, breaking the silence as she rocked Sam to sleep. His voice carried a quiet awe, tinged with gratitude. "Most people would be terrified. Or leave." Eleanor shook her head, her hands still cradling the baby. "I couldn't leave him," she admitted, almost breathlessly. "Or, you. I don't even know why, but," she trailed off, unsure if she had spoken too freely. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply observed her, the weight of the night settling between them. Then, slowly, he nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good. You're different from what I expected." It was not a compliment about appearance, nor a remark about strength. It was deeper than that, a recognition that she had stayed when most would have turned away, that she had chosen compassion over convenience. Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. By the time the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, casting soft pinks and golds across the prairie, the night's tension had shifted. Eleanor sat on the floor, Sam asleep in her arms, and allowed herself a small sigh of relief. The rancher moved quietly around the room, preparing for the morning chores, but he kept glancing back at her, eyes softening with every step. The silence between them was no longer heavy with grief or fear. It was a quiet understanding, a fragile bond forming in the shared responsibility of life and care. Eleanor realized she had discovered something she hadn't anticipated, a connection that went beyond the job she had come to seek, a sense of belonging that warmed her more than the fire ever could. And in the faint light of dawn, the rancher finally spoke, his voice steady yet carrying a note of vulnerability. "I think I might be able to do this. With you here." Eleanor looked up, meeting his gaze, and for the first time since the world had pressed down on her shoulders, she believed in the possibility of hope. Midnight had brought her here, to this house, to this man, and to this tiny life depending on both of them. And somehow, in the quiet hours of struggle and care, Eleanor felt that she might have found her place in a world that had once seemed impossibly harsh. The first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, painting the endless prairie in shades of gold and rose. Eleanor sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, cradling Sam in her arms as he slept, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest a soothing balm to her nerves. The events of the night played through her mind like a slow, vivid reel, her knock at the door, the grief etched into the rancher's face, and the fragile trust that had formed in those quiet hours. The rancher, tall and rugged as the land itself, moved quietly about the room. He fed the horses and tended the animals with the practiced care of someone who had lived a life defined by labor and responsibility. Yet, despite his efficiency, he kept glancing back at Eleanor, his expression softened by something more than gratitude. It was awe, respect, and perhaps the faintest flicker of hope that he had not felt in months. "You stayed through the night," he said finally, his voice low and steady, carrying over the gentle sounds of the morning. He leaned against the doorway, boots covered in frost, eyes scanning her face with an intensity that made Eleanor's chest tighten. "Not many would." Eleanor smiled faintly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "I couldn't leave him," she said, nodding toward Sam, who stirred slightly in her arms. "And I couldn't leave you, either. I don't know why, maybe because..." Her voice faltered, and she paused, unsure if she was crossing some invisible boundary. "Because you needed someone." For a moment, he said nothing, only watched her. The silence was not uncomfortable, it was charged, the kind of stillness that carries the weight of unspoken truths. Then he stepped closer, his rough hands brushing against hers as he reached for the baby. Sam stirred, his tiny fists curling around the rancher's fingers, and Eleanor felt her heart swell. "He trusts you," she murmured, a mixture of surprise and relief in her voice. "I think we all do," he replied, his eyes meeting hers with a softness she hadn't anticipated. "Me too." The morning unfolded slowly, but each moment carried the weight of significance. Eleanor helped with chores, carried buckets of water, and tended to the animals under his watchful eye. Each task became an opportunity to connect, to understand the rhythm of his life and the quiet strength that had allowed him to survive despite the heartbreak. And as she worked, she noticed small things, the way his jaw tightened when he focused, the subtle curve of his lips when he thought she wasn't looking, the gentle hum he made when he soothed Sam. By mid-morning, the ranch felt alive with something it hadn't known for months. Laughter echoed softly as Eleanor fumbled with a particularly stubborn feed sack, and the rancher chuckled, a deep, rich sound that made her smile involuntarily. Sam gurgled in response, tiny eyes sparkling as if he too recognized the fragile peace settling into the house. As the sun rose higher, Eleanor finally allowed herself to sit by the porch, Sam cradled against her chest. The rancher joined her, leaning against the railing, the vast expanse of land stretching endlessly beyond them. The wind was gentler now, carrying the sweet scent of earth and grass, a promise of new beginnings. "I didn't expect this," he admitted, voice quiet but steady. "A stranger showing up at midnight, staying through the night, and now, somehow, you're here. Helping me, keeping him safe, keeping me sane." Eleanor looked at him, her heart catching in her throat. "Maybe I was meant to," she said softly. "I don't know, but I do know that I feel like I belong here. With you, and him." For the first time since tragedy had struck his life, the rancher smiled fully, without hesitation, without the weight of grief holding him back. "I think I might survive this," he said, his voice carrying both relief and a quiet joy. "With you here, I might even thrive." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest, deeper than anything she had known in months. She reached out, taking his hand in hers, and he held it firmly, as if anchoring himself to this newfound hope. Sam stirred again, letting out a tiny squeak, and Eleanor laughed, a soft, musical sound that blended with the wind and the morning light. The prairie stretched endlessly beyond them, wild and untamed, yet in that vastness, they had found something extraordinary. Eleanor had arrived seeking work, a lifeline in the darkness of her own struggles. Instead, she had found connection, trust, and the fragile beginnings of love. And for the rancher, whose life had been reduced to grief and survival, she had brought hope, warmth, and the promise of family. As the morning sun bathed them in gold, Eleanor realized that this was more than coincidence or fate. It was a beginning, an unspoken agreement between two people who had suffered, endured, and now dared to hope. Midnight had brought them together, and the light of day was their first true moment of peace. In the quiet, with a baby sleeping between them and the world waking slowly around them, Eleanor and the widowed rancher found something neither had expected but both had longed for: a chance to rebuild, to love, and to belong.